I need you and you need me. In that spirit, will you recite this covenant with me? Love is the spirit of our people, and service is our call. To build the beloved community, to seek fuller truths in love, to dwell together in peace, to offer aid and affirmation, and to live for one another. This is our covenant. Our second reading today is by Mia Mingus from Dreaming Accountability. Accountability is not a destination. It is a skill we can build and practice. It is an art, a craft, an alchemy we could learn how to wield, just as we have learned how to wield hurt and shame and fear. If accountability is a skill we value, then we must make room and make commitments to practice it ourselves each day, each week, each year. We can start small and build up our skills from there. We could start with our everyday relationships and those closest to us, our families, our friends, our partners, our coworkers, our earth. We could start with ourselves. Good morning. I want to say how lucky we are to have Reverend John Crestwell with us in ministry, aren't we? To have someone who can speak with vision and love and clarity to us like that. And also this morning, I want to say how lucky we are to have our Building the Beloved community team, who has found this wonderful resource, the subtle acts of exclusion, for us to engage in to help our community move forward. I want to speak to you today about a sermon I have been holding in my heart for you since June. I want to share with you a story of a profound change that has happened in the UU Ministers Association, perhaps the profoundest change that has occurred within UU ministry since women joined Unitarian Universalist ministry in large numbers. And I share it with you because I think it offers us a model of where we could head to together. Engaging in our model of subtle acts of exclusion is an important first step towards that. The story of this profound shift, I believe, began in the Barry Street lecture of 2016. Now, some of you might remember that our wonderful Fred Muir in 2012 was invited to give the Barry Street lecture. It's a profound honor. And in 2016, Gail Seavey was invited to give this lecture. And her lecture was entitled, "If Our Secrets Define Us." She talked about how the secrets that had often come to define the health of our congregations were the secrets of ministerial misconduct, and often sexual misconduct, but misconduct that in some way wielded power inappropriately. Her talk was profound and provocative. And I remember feeling a desire to change our systems towards one of health. Shortly after it finished, we were told that, as is the tradition, traditionally the transcripts or recordings or both of the Barry Street lectures are available online at the UU Ministers Association, but hers would be redacted. Specifically, she named some of our UU ministerial colleagues who had sexually misconducted and were still in ministry, and she named them by name. And the response came back to her, you need to take those names out. There's legal reasons, and we just can't do this. And in short, she was silenced. I was one of a few UU ministerial colleagues who were rather incensed by this and We started to meet in bathrooms and hallways to plan how to respond. And we said, let's settle down and let's get organized and let's write a letter to the Unitarian Universalist Ministerial Association board. We were not the only ones. The board, in the year and a half to follow, began to hear more and more about colleagues who had misabused their power, sometimes through sexual misconduct or professional misconduct or bullying or a number of behaviors that were simply not aligned with the values that we hold ourselves to. Finally, in 2017, the number of these instances named grew so great that the UUNA board put together 2 working groups to propose changes to the ministerial guidelines that all members of the UU Ministers Association hold themselves to in terms of providing an inspiration of how we should act and also the types of behaviors that we'll hold ourselves accountable to. And so pretty quickly they said, we need to have a clearer, brighter line against ministerial misconduct. And so it was in 2018, I believe, that they added sexual harassment to the list of sexual behaviors that would not be acceptable amongst UU ministers. Now, that might have solved it. They added a little other language, and that might have solved the things that Gail Seavey really pointed out in her Berry Street lecture. But the rising tide of voices made it clear that that was not our sole problems. We also had problems with white supremacy, heterosexualism, ableism, and other forms of oppression. And so these 2 working groups were tasked with saying, remove anything in our guidelines that supports the perpetuation of white supremacy, heterosexualism, and other forms of structural oppression. And instead, put in language that guides us towards right behavior. What's interesting is the 2 working groups discovered that they needed a profound shift in framework, not just language, but framework. And the insight that they got was this: keeping rules is different than keeping covenant. Keeping rules is different than keeping covenant. Instead of keeping to a bright line, covenant asks us to keep our promises. So what have we promised ourselves? To our values, to Unitarian Universalism, to our people, to the promise itself at the heart of our faith. But in particular, when it came to these guidelines, the shapers of these guidelines identified 2 promises. First, the promise of learning from one another how to truly be covenantal and collegial. In short, to live with and for each other in mind. And second, the promise of healing. So the Guidelines Committee on Ethics said, if our faith is to have any hope of healing in this world, we need to begin by healing our own community. Our covenant can be a means of perpetuating systems of oppression among ourselves and our ministries, or our covenant can create space for the flourishing of love, trust, and boundless creativity. And the Guidelines Committee on Accountability said, we continue to seek ways to strengthen our covenant and nurture a learning and supportive culture. We have developed a process for accountability that honors our desire to learn and grow from and with each other. We must create a process that invites engagement and provides a range of options that centers relationships and meets the needs of those who are harmed. The shift to framework spread through those in membership of the UUMA, ministers across the nation, because they asked us a few generous questions. What do you need to practice accountability? What have you risked to practice accountability? What do we collectively gain when people are willing to take those risks? What do you need to practice forgiveness? What have you risked to practice forgiveness? What do we collectively gain when people are willing to forgive? What obstacles do you find in your path in engaging in ongoing learning on matters of inclusion, hospitality, and equity? What would make it easier for you to engage in these areas? How can we avoid merely becoming a place of social support for one another so we could also be a place of authentic community, of learning and growth? The framework that they put in place said, we want to be a learning people where accountability is held by all of us. And so they wrote in these guidelines that we have an explicit duty to speak up if we notice an aberration of covenant, large or small. And we recognized that accountability works when someone you trust pulls you aside. Now, this sounds like you have to monitor everything you say, that even a small thing could be held against you. But rather, the point that they were looking towards was two things. One, how can the small things be corrected early? How can we be called into a greater awareness of how each other's lives? And second, how can we identify patterns? Patterns in one person's behavior because we recognize that the bully was also the one who wasn't abiding by professional standards, who was also sometimes the person who became abusive. And to recognize patterns in our greater movement, to say, here are things that as a people, we tend not to be doing that well. As a people, we tend to have some microaggressions. And as a people, we need to learn. I think that's so much in the spirit of why our BBC brought the subtle acts of exclusion today. Because as a people, this was something we really need to learn. And then the second thing framework was that there was a belief that accountability should be matched with a belief in healing for all, a healing based in the covenant. It worked very hard to do away with the good bad binary, the victim abuser binary, and to say, yes, there are some egregious examples that need to be handled in a legal fashion or through a full adjudicatory process. But most of the time, what we are requiring is that both parties engage in dialogue with a right relations person, someone trained in reconciliation, trained in harm reduction, trained in trauma-informed care. And in that dialogue, to search for a ground that is healing. Because they believe that perhaps this healing could be for both parties. That healing could occur when new understandings of how we live, how we must live and do live for one another are understood. So instead of one person being wounded and one shamed, one expelled and one vindicated, there's a restoration of relationship. They said, there's a lot of technical things we may be asking you to do, and I invite you to think about this for us, but it's not always about the specifics. Instead, what we're aiming for is a culture change where we become more sensitive to one another, more responsible for our words and actions, more willing to challenge each other with respect. The covenant that we recited together earlier includes many important relational commitments, such as seeking fuller truths in love, having love be the spirit of our people, offering aid and affirmation, building the beloved community, dwelling together in peace. While our covenant requires attention and intention to practice all year long, when we engage in anti-oppression work, it needs to be at the forefront of our minds. UUCA isn't so different from the UUMA if we embrace covenanting with one another. It is the responsibility of living into our covenant can't be relegated to a small group of folks. Rather, it is the responsibility of each and every one of us. Can't we have a vision of a congregation that uses covenant so effectively that it supports and enhances our time together? As I close, I leave you with another reading by Mia Mingus from Dreaming Accountability. What if accountability wasn't scary? It will never be easy or comfortable, but what if it wasn't scary? What if our own accountability wasn't something we ran from, but something that we ran towards and desired, appreciated, held as sacred? What if we cherished opportunities to take accountability as precious opportunities to practice liberation, to practice love, to practice the kinds of peoples, elders to be, and souls we want to be? I believe it can be so. Let us work to make it so today. Amen.